Imagine standing on the corner of Front Street and Madison in the summer of 1889. The air still smells of smoke. Where buildings once stood, there is nothing but charred timber and ash, stretching block after block like a blackened graveyard of commerce. On June 6th of that year, a glue pot caught fire in a cabinet shop, and within 12 hours, 25 city blocks had vanished. Over $1 million in property reduced to embers. Seattle, this scrappy lumber town on the edge of Puget Sound, had been erased. But here is what makes this story remarkable. The people did not flee. They did not mourn for long. They rebuilt. Within weeks, city leaders made a decision that would shape Seattle for the next century. No more wooden buildings in the commercial district, only brick and stone. And because the streets constantly flooded at high tide, engineers proposed something audacious. They would raise the entire downtown by 1 to 2 stories, burying the old sidewalks underground. Workers laid new streets on top of the ruins, creating the mysterious underground passages that tourists still explore today. By 1893, Pioneer Square had risen from the ashes, its red brick buildings standing proud against the gray Pacific sky. Seattle had learned its first lesson. Destruction is not the end. It is an invitation to build something better. But survival alone would not make Seattle great. The city needed an opportunity, a spark, and in 1897, that spark would arrive on a steamship called the Portland, carrying something that would change everything. On July 17, 1897, the steamship Portland docked at Schwabacher Wharf, and the news spread through Seattle like wildfire. A ton of gold had arrived from the Klondike, nuggets as big as a man's thumb, fortunes pulled from frozen rivers in the Yukon. Within hours, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer printed the headline that would transform the city forever. Men quit their jobs on the spot. Doctors abandoned their patients. The mayor of Seattle himself resigned to join the rush north. But here is the genius of what happened next. Seattle did not need to find gold. Seattle found something better. It found the miners. City merchants realized that every prospector heading to Alaska needed supplies, picks, and shovels, wool blankets, dried food, rubber boots, and most importantly, a year's worth of provisions required by Canadian law to cross the border. Seattle positioned itself as the gateway to the goldfields, and money flowed into the city like the rivers of the Yukon. Outfitters grew rich overnight. Hotels filled to capacity. New businesses opened every day. An estimated 100,000 fortune seekers passed through Seattle between 1897 and 1899, and most of them left their money here before they ever saw a speck of gold. The city's population doubled, its reputation soared, and a spirit of entrepreneurship took root that would define Seattle for generations. The gold rush eventually faded, but Seattle had discovered its true treasure: location, ambition, and the willingness to seize opportunity when it knocked. The new century was approaching, and Seattle stood ready. Railroads were coming, forests stretched endlessly to the horizon, and a new wave of immigrants would soon arrive to build something permanent. The 20th century arrived with the sound of axes and the shriek of steam whistles, and Seattle threw itself into the business of building with an energy that bordered on obsession. The forests of the Pacific Northwest seemed infinite. Douglas fir and western red cedar standing tall as cathedrals, and the sawmills along the waterfront worked day and night, turning ancient trees into lumber that would build homes from California to Japan. By 1900, Seattle's population had reached 80,000 souls. But this was only the beginning, because the railroads were coming, and with them, the world. The Great Northern Railway, completed just years earlier, now connected this remote corner of America to Chicago, to New York, to everywhere that mattered. And suddenly, Seattle was no longer isolated, it was a destination. The ships that departed Elliott Bay carried timber across the Pacific, and the ships that returned brought something equally valuable: people. Japanese immigrants settled in the Nihonmachi district. Scandinavian fishermen made Ballard their home. Chinese laborers who had built the railroads now built new lives along King Street, and Italian families planted gardens in Rainier Valley. By 1910, the population had exploded to over 230,000, nearly tripling in a single decade. And on August 17, 1907, a farmer named Frank Goodwin drove his wagon to the corner of Pike Place and First Avenue to sell his vegetables directly to housewives tired of paying middlemen. And the Pike Place market was born, a living, breathing connection between the land and the people that endures to this day. Seattle was no longer a frontier outpost. It was becoming a true American city. But across the Atlantic, storm clouds were gathering. In 1914, war erupted in Europe, and though the ocean seemed to offer protection, Seattle would soon discover that no place on Earth could escape what was coming. When America entered the Great War in April of 1917, Seattle transformed almost overnight into an arsenal of democracy. The shipyards along the Duwamish River roared to life, employing tens of thousands of workers who hammered steel hulls together with a fury that matched the battlefields of France. And by the war's end, Seattle had launched more ships than any other city on the Pacific coast. But victory brought unexpected turmoil, because the workers who had sacrificed during wartime now demanded their share of peace. On February 6, 1919, something unprecedented happened. 65,000 workers walked off their jobs in the first general strike in American history. Shipbuilders and streetcar operators, janitors and firefighters, all united in solidarity. For 5 days, Seattle stood still, the silence broken only by union-run milk trucks delivering essentials to hospitals and families. The strike ended without violence, but it left a mark on the city's soul, a reminder that Seattle's working people would not be ignored. And even as the labor battles faded, a new industry was quietly taking shape in a small red barn on the shores of Lake Union. A man named William Boeing had built his first airplane there in 1916, a fragile contraption of wood and fabric, and now his company was winning contracts to carry airmail across the mountains. By the mid-1920s, Boeing airplanes were crisscrossing the American West, and Seattle began to look upward, toward the clouds, toward a future written in vapor trails. The Roaring Twenties brought jazz to the dance halls, Prohibition brought bootleggers to the waterfront, and prosperity seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. No one standing on a Seattle street corner in 1929 could have imagined that within months, the stock market would collapse, fortunes would evaporate, and the longest economic nightmare in American history would begin. The Great Depression arrived in Seattle like a cold Pacific fog that refused to lift, settling into every neighborhood, every household, every heart. By 1933, nearly 1 in 4 workers had lost their jobs, and along the mudflats south of downtown, a sprawling encampment of tin shacks and cardboard shelters appeared, home to thousands of desperate families who had nowhere else to go. They called these places Hoovervilles, bitter monuments to a president who seemed unable or unwilling to help. And Seattle's Hooverville became one of the largest in the nation, a city within a city where men who once built ships now scavenged for scraps. The timber industry collapsed, the shipyards fell silent, and even Boeing, that promising young company, shrank to fewer than 700 employees, surviving only by building furniture when no one would buy airplanes. But history has a way of turning tragedy into transformation. And on December 7th, 1941, everything changed. The attack on Pearl Harbor plunged America into a global conflict, and Seattle found itself on the front lines of a war that would be won in the skies over Europe and the Pacific. Boeing received contracts worth billions, and within months, the company employed over 40,000 workers assembling the legendary B-17 Flying Fortress, and later the massive B-29 Super Fortress, the very planes that would help bring the war to an end. Women flooded into the factories, taking positions once reserved for men, riveting wings and welding fuselages with skill and determination. Seattle had become the arsenal of the Pacific, and when victory finally came in 1945, the city emerged stronger than ever before. Peace brought new dreams, and Seattle's veterans returned home ready to build families, buy houses, and chase a prosperity that seemed finally within reach. The post-war years arrived with an optimism that felt almost intoxicating, and Seattle's returning soldiers wanted what every American wanted: a house with a yard, a car in the driveway, and a future brighter than the past. New neighborhoods sprang up almost overnight in Bellevue, in Kirkland, in Renton, modest homes with picket fences where young families could plant roots and raise children far from the crowded city center. The automobile became king, and to accommodate it, engineers began construction on Interstate 5, a massive concrete river that would slice through the heart of Seattle, connecting suburbs to downtown but forever dividing neighborhoods that had grown up together. Boeing, meanwhile, was betting its entire future on a revolutionary idea: the commercial jet airliner. In 1954, the company rolled out the prototype of what would become the 707, a sleek silver machine that promised to shrink the world and make air travel available to ordinary people. When the 707 entered service in 1958, it transformed not just aviation, but Seattle itself, bringing thousands of engineering jobs and cementing the city's identity as a place where the future was built. And then came the crown jewel, the moment when Seattle announced itself to the entire planet. In 1962, the Century 21 Exposition opened its gates, a World's Fair celebrating the space age, and rising above it all stood the Space Needle, 605 feet of steel and glass that became an instant icon. Over 10 million visitors came that year to glimpse tomorrow, and when they left, they carried Seattle's name with them. Yet even as the fair dazzled the world, storm clouds were forming. Boeing's fortunes would soon shift, and Seattle was about to face its darkest decade since the Depression. The glow of the World's Fair faded quickly, and by the late 1960s, Seattle found itself sliding toward an abyss. The Vietnam War was winding down, government contracts were drying up, and Boeing, the company that had carried the city on its wings for half a century, began to fall from the sky. In 1970 and 71, Boeing laid off nearly 60,000 workers, more than half its entire workforce, and the shockwaves rippled through every corner of the region. Restaurants closed, car dealerships emptied, homes went into foreclosure, and families packed their belongings and fled to cities where jobs still existed. Near the airport, someone erected a billboard that became infamous across America. Will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights? It felt like the end, but Seattle has never been a city that surrenders easily. Even in the depths of despair, seeds of reinvention were being planted. In 1971, 3 friends who loved good coffee opened a small shop in Pike Place Market, selling fresh roasted beans to a city that mostly drank instant, and they called it Starbucks. That same year, a young outdoorsman opened a tiny equipment store that would eventually become REI, and environmental activists began organizing to protect the forests and waters that made the Pacific Northwest unique. The counterculture flourished. Artists and musicians filled the cheap apartments that economic collapse had created. And slowly, quietly, a new Seattle began to emerge from the wreckage. The city was learning to diversify, to dream beyond airplanes, to trust in creativity and entrepreneurship rather than any single industry. By 1980, the worst had passed, and something extraordinary was stirring in the garages and basements of the Puget Sound region, something that would change not just Seattle, but the entire world. The 1980s began quietly in Seattle, a city still healing its wounds, still searching for its next chapter. But in the suburbs to the east, in a place called Redmond, two young men named Bill Gates and Paul Allen were building something that would reshape human civilization. Microsoft had started modestly, writing software for hobbyist computers. But by the mid-80s, it had become the engine powering the personal computer revolution, and its success drew talent and money to the Seattle region like a magnet. Suddenly, engineers and programmers were arriving from around the world, and the city that had once depended on timber and airplanes was becoming a capital of the digital age. And then came the music. In 1991, a band from Aberdeen called Nirvana released an album titled Nevermind, and the sound that poured from radios and stereos was raw, angry, and utterly authentic, the sound of a generation that refused to be polished or packaged. Seattle became the center of the grunge movement, and bands like Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, and Alice in Chains transformed the city into a pilgrimage site for young people seeking something real. The flannel shirts, the rain-soaked streets, the coffee shops filled with poets and dreamers. Seattle had found a new identity, rebellious and creative, and impossibly cool. In 1994, a former Wall Street analyst named Jeff Bezos rented a small house in Bellevue and began selling books online, calling his company Amazon after the mighty river. Few noticed at the time, but the seeds of a retail revolution had been planted. By 1999, Seattle stood at the threshold of a new millennium, its skyline growing, its reputation soaring, its future limitless. The year 2000 approached with celebration and anxiety, and no one could predict how dramatically the next 2 decades would transform this city by the sound. The new millennium arrived with fireworks over Elliott Bay, and a sense that Seattle had finally become what it always dreamed of being, a world-class city where the future was invented daily. Amazon, that modest online bookstore, had grown into something unprecedented, a company that seemed to sell everything to everyone everywhere, and its expansion transformed entire neighborhoods almost overnight. South Lake Union, once a forgotten industrial wasteland of warehouses and auto shops, became a gleaming campus of glass towers where tens of thousands of workers streamed each morning, young and ambitious and drawn from every corner of the globe. Microsoft continued its dominance from Redmond. Starbucks exported Seattle's coffee culture to nearly every country on Earth, and new companies seemed to sprout weekly, each one promising to disrupt some industry or revolutionize some aspect of daily life. But prosperity cast long shadows. As tech workers flooded into the city, housing prices climbed to heights that would have seemed absurd just a decade earlier, and families who had lived in Seattle for generations found themselves pushed toward the margins, unable to afford the neighborhoods where they had grown up. Cranes dominated the skyline, luxury apartments rose on every block, and the soul of the city seemed to hang in the balance between growth and identity, between progress and preservation. Protests erupted over housing policy, over homelessness, over the very question of who Seattle belonged to. The newcomers with their stock options and electric cars, or the artists and workers and dreamers who had built its culture through decades of struggle. By 2019, Seattle had become one of the fastest-growing cities in America, its population surging past 700,000, its influence reaching around the world. And then, in early 2020, the world itself came to a sudden and unexpected stop. The years 2020 and 2021 tested Seattle in ways that no one could have anticipated, as a global health crisis forced the city to confront questions it had never before considered. Streets that once hummed with traffic fell silent, Pike Place Market stood nearly empty, and the coffee shops that had defined Seattle's social fabric closed their doors for months at a time. Remote work became the norm almost overnight, and thousands of tech workers discovered they could do their jobs from anywhere, leading some to wonder whether the city that had drawn them would hold them once the restrictions lifted. It was a period of isolation and uncertainty, of adaptation and reflection, and Seattle, like cities everywhere, was forced to reimagine what urban life could and should be. But resilience is written into Seattle's genetic code, passed down from the pioneers who rebuilt after the Great Fire, from the workers who survived the Depression, from the dreamers who refused to turn out the lights when Boeing collapsed. By 2022 and 2023, the city was finding its footing again, embracing hybrid work models, investing in public transit and green infrastructure, and rediscovering the waterfront that had given birth to it all. New restaurants opened in old spaces, artists returned to studios they had feared losing forever, and the eternal rain continued to fall on streets that had weathered more than a century of change. Today, as 2026 approaches, Seattle stands transformed yet recognizable, a city of innovation and contradiction, of ambition and compassion, still reaching toward the clouds, just as it did when William Boeing built his first airplane in a lakeside barn. The Space Needle still rises above Elliott Bay, a silver sentinel watching over a city that has never stopped becoming, never stopped believing that the best chapter is always the next one waiting to be written.